Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Graham Shimmield, Executive Director at the Bigelow Laboratory for Ocean Sciences. Welcome to our first foray to Rockland for one of our series of Café Scientifique lectures. We thought we'd try something rather different this evening, so it's great to see such a big turnout. Something different is to have a conversation rather than the standard scientists in front of a PowerPoint presentation droning on for 30 minutes. We thought we could interact in a rather more personal way, and I'm delighted to be able to share the stage with Colin Woodard, who I'll introduce in a moment. In terms of the way this will play out, we're going to discuss some of the key issues in the oceans over the next 30 minutes. And then we're going to invite you at the end to come and stand up and ask us some questions as well. It could be on anything that we've touched on in the previous 30 minutes or any other subject of your choosing. It'd be good if it is linked to the oceans, both of us. Although Colin is probably a lot better than me at going off into politics or other areas than that. But no, seriously, thank you very much for coming this evening, and I hope that the next 30 minutes will be enlightening. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Colin. Colin, as I'm sure many of you know, is from here, whereas I'm from away, which will become very apparent as we go on this evening. He's an investigative journalist and commentator, currently now with the Portland Press Herald and the Maine Sunday Telegram. Of course, he's well known for his books, Lobster Coast, Ocean's End, of which we'll hear some parts of this evening, and most recently, American Nations. As we know, he's a native from Maine, and he's worked in many foreign countries, and I think that gives Colin a unique experience in order to share both the stories, the anecdotes, and indeed the actions of people in other parts of the world as they relate to the oceans. He's a member of the Sea Space Symposium, which is an association of leading ocean and space explorers, scientists, policymakers, and philanthropists. He holds an MA from the University of Chicago and an MA and BA from Tufts University. Colin.
Thank you very much. Well, allow me to introduce Graham Shimmield. Graham received his PhD in marine geochemistry from the University of Edinburgh in Scotland in 1985. We remained on the chemical oceanography faculty until 1996. He then became director of the Scottish Association for Marine Sciences. His particular interest scientifically is in marine geochemistry, which includes identifying the indicators of ocean and climate change and examining human impacts and contamination in coastal and deep seas. His work's taken him to all of the oceans in the world, from atolls in the Pacific impacted by El Nino events to the polar regions and the consequences of melting sea ice, to studies of offshore oil installations and their decommissioning. He's had significant involvement also in marine biotechnology startups on the private sector side. In 2000, he was awarded the title of honorary professor at the University of St. Andrews. He is a fellow at the Royal Society of Edinburgh and the Institute of Biology. He's been president and vice president of the new European Federation of Marine Sciences and Technology Societies, and he was chairman of the European Census for Marine Life program. He's published over 65 scientific peer-reviewed articles, and he joined the Bigelow Laboratory of Ocean Sciences as executive director and president in March 2008. In October 2011, Maine Biz magazine here in Maine named him to its next list of the 10 people shaping the future of Maine's economy. And may I say also, I've been serving on the advisory board of the Bigelow Laboratory for the past 3 years, and it's a great pleasure to work with him as well. And he's a fantastic communicator of scientific and ocean things to the public. And I'm very pleased to work with him and be with him here tonight.
Thanks, Colin. So in my introduction for Colin, I alluded to the fact that he'd spent time in many countries around the world, but in particular, his early journalistic career was based in Eastern Europe, particularly Hungary, rather a long way from the oceans, covering some of the strife and troubles that we were having in Europe at that time. So Colin, how did you get interested in the oceans being so far away from the coast?
Yeah, it's rather ironic to grow up in Maine and be around the oceans and the coast all the time, and then to actually get involved in ocean reporting and ocean sciences by being in landlocked Hungary. But there is a reason for this. I was in Eastern Europe before, during, and for years after the collapse of communism. And one of the stories you could not miss was the environmental degradation of the region. There was never any Clean Air Act or Clean Water Act in the Warsaw Pact, and basically all the products of industry went into the environment unabated, and the results were sometimes quite shocking. And I was covering a lot of those things. They were just front and center. This was not a peripheral issue. And being based in Budapest, where the Danube flows through the city underneath all those great bridges, and everything in Hungary, by the way, is named after the Danube, from the hotels to the frequent flyer program on the national airline. You can't miss the place. But it's also, it occurred to us, broad-thinking journalists, that the Danube travels for 2,000 miles and drains half of Europe, including, both east and west, and is shared with its tributaries, a sort of tree of tributaries, by all these countries in Eastern Europe and the Balkans, which at the time, history was sort of thawing out, and they'd all been historic enemies of one another, and how are they possibly going to coordinate pollution abatement efforts when they all hate each other and can't wait to dump poison and toxin upstream from one another's tributaries and get revenge, lead smelter waste for Hungary, there you go. They could pay them back later in another tributary. So it was a great story of shared resource and human boundaries and the difficulties that the region was going to face. And a lot of us ended up writing about it. And it was a big deal because this river system, the whole lower half of it, you had a city like Budapest, 2.5 million people, and all of the sewage half of the sewage went into the Danube untreated, aside from just kind of running through screens. And all of the sewage of Belgrade, which is 2 million people, of Bratislava, which is 750,000, of Bucharest, which is 2 million. In fact, every single city and community on the lower Danube, once you got beyond Vienna, was pretty much dumping all their sewage straight into the river system, and it was being carried downstream. And in addition, the Soviets, in Soviet agriculture, you basically, if you were in the Warsaw Pact countries, you got these free imports of highly subsidized chemical fertilizers. So you had no incentive not to just dump them in whatever quantities you can, because the goal was to meet the 5-year plan. Produce this much wheat, and if you produce more than all the better, and if the inputs are free, then you're going to dump tons of inputs, so many that they'll all wash into the river. So the basic point was the river was a complete mess, and we were writing about that, and we thought we had the big enough lens, the big enough goggles on, but nobody among us all clever people who were writing about this, broadly speaking, were thinking about it widely enough and asking the obvious question, where does the Danube River go? And the answer is the Danube River, and this whole load of pollution goes all the way down through Europe and ends up at the Black Sea, which is a semi-enclosed sea the size of California, and that's where all the waste was going. And all of the pollution from Chernobyl disaster and all the toxins and things coming out of the lead smelters. But the worst thing of all turned out to be all those nutrients from the sewerage and the fertilizer that were going into the system. And we all got a nasty wake-up call when, in the early 90s, in the space of 2 or 3 years, the Black Sea, which has been providing fish and ecosystem services for the Mediterranean cultures and all the way forward for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years has been nourishing civilization since ancient Greece, it suddenly suffered a biochemical disaster that almost completely destroyed the ecosystem in the space of 2 or 3 years without anybody really realizing ahead of time it was about to happen. So what happened in brief? Well, all of those nutrients were coming into the system. And nutrient pollution doesn't sound very scary, right? But the problem is that in the ocean, like on land, life essentially begins with photosynthesis, except most of the plants are microscopic little algae you can't see that are in the water column. And the only thing that's sort of limiting them, they kind of got everything they need, except there's usually shortages in most of the oceans of key nutrients, phosphorus and nitrogen, which happen to be available in huge quantities in both sewer and fertilizer. So just like a lake, where you get an algae bloom in a lake, that's what started happening in the Black Sea. There was so many fertilizer, nutrients, and nitrogen and phosphorus available that the algae went crazy. And to make matters worse, Nicolae Ceausescu, the mad dictator of Romania, had been going around destroying the great natural filter at the end of the Danube. The Danube ends, like many great river systems do, in a great delta country, the Danube Delta. And this acts as a sponge and cleanses out all the nastiness in the system, including nutrients. But he had gone around deciding that, no, this was a waste of Romania's potential. He was going to grow rice in the fields. So he started clearing them all. And of course, immediately the salt water intruded and killed all the rice. But no matter, we will build more. And so on and so forth. So he was making the matters worse. And this combination of things suddenly caused the nutrients to double and quadruple, depending on what you were looking at, and started prompting these enormous mats of algae to start forming. So much algae was blooming that the little tiny zooplankton, little microscopic animals that go around eating these things couldn't keep up. And make matters worse, they've been overfishing some of the other creatures that might have helped eat some of these things. But long and the short of it is more and more uneaten algae started piling up, and what happens when that occurs in a system is it's left to the bacteria to do it, and when the bacteria in a marine system eat up the algae and decompose them, they need to strip the oxygen out of the water, all the dissolved oxygen. And remember, fish and animals and stuff, right, that's why they have gills, is they actually are breathing and they need the oxygen down there. So as all that stripping took place, anything that needed oxygen either died or ran away and was displaced. The things that needed to be here to eat suddenly couldn't be there because they couldn't breathe there, or they need to go over here to breathe, sorry, you can't do it. Everything was thrown into disarray. And the algae mats were getting so thick that it was cutting off the light, penetrating to the bottom to the plants, the seaweeds and things that are sort of big plants on the bottom that provide the structure and habitat where everything lives. All of that was dying as well. So you had this great sort of biochemical disaster. And to top it off, and this is a story of multiple human interactions and pressures on the ocean that we think of totally separately, right? Agriculture on one side, fisheries policy on another, land use development on the third. Well, to add in shipping, because in the 80s, just before all this disaster happened, a passing freighter pumped out its bilges. It was coming from North America, apparently, and it pumped out a comb jelly, native to the area around Virginia and Maryland, into the Black Sea, and the Black Sea system being weakened the way it was. This little funny jellyfish-like creature had no natural predators and went completely berserk, running around eating what was left of the little zooplankton that would have eaten the algae down. It went so berserk that it went from maybe 1, 2, 3 individual little comb jellies to 1 billion tons of comb jellies. Now, how big is that? That is 10 times the global typical catch of all the fishing boats in the world, as reported to the UN FAO. A lot of comb jelly. So what I'm telling you is that in a space of just a few years, the Black Sea system was reduced to just jellies and slime, which unfortunately is a trend that a lot of scientists have been seeing all over the world system, although not quite as bad as that particular one. And so one of the things that's always intrigued me, and I wanted to ask you about, Graham, is, I mean, all this small stuff at the bottom that we can't even see and aren't usually bothered with, I mean, why does it matter, and why is it important to study it or understand it at all?
Well, Colin, you've touched on some of the key parts anyway. These microorganisms are doing a number of things, sort of services, if you like, for the way in which the planet is operating. So let me just put a little bit of that into context for you. We're pretty familiar with all the larger, the charismatic animals, and maybe even the plants in the ocean, the whales, the dolphin, and the fish. If we thought about their total mass, that would only be 10% of the biomass in the ocean. That other 90% are these microorganisms. And by my definition, you need a microscope to be able to see them, or my glasses. No, they are pretty small. And if you go right the way down to the smallest size, just the volume of your fingernail, you're probably going to have over 1 million viruses and bacteria just in that small droplet of water. So there are literally billions to trillions of these microorganisms doing things. Well, what are they doing? They are improving the quality of the water. Many of them, the microscopic plants, they're photosynthesizing, which essentially means taking up carbon dioxide and producing oxygen. And they do that so efficiently that the audience sitting here, every time you're taking a second breath, you're breathing the oxygen that's been produced by marine phytoplankton. So they are essentially making the planet hospitable.
Handy to have them around.
Very handy to have them around. Of course, if they get out of control, then we have some of the problems like the Black Sea. So that introduces the next kind of aspect of microorganisms. How do they regulate themselves? What is the community structure? How does that operate? So places like Bigelow Laboratory essentially draw together all the different types of sciences around the microbial life in the ocean. And the more we look into the microbes, the more we see. So let me explain that a little bit more. Again, on land, and man obviously is a terrestrial-based organism, so we are very familiar with the world around us from a terrestrial point of view, often forgetting that 70% of the ocean is actually underwater. But that other 30%, we sort of look at you know, an oak tree, an insect, and you know, a tortoise. And we will think how different those organisms are. They sure are in terms of their shape and form, but genetically, they're actually somewhat similar. If we go into the microbial life in the ocean, we will find more genetic diversity in some of those microbes than what exists in the terrestrial landmass. We have a very terrestrial-centric view of life. Life in the ocean has evolved in a very different way, and it has evolved because it has managed an equilibrium of sorts, sustaining food, sustaining biogeochemical cycles, adapting to change. The real challenge is what is going to be happening going forward into the future. So I sort of wanted to ask you about that perspective of change, because I know as you've traveled around the world and met people, you've come into contact with people who've really drawn your awareness to the way things are changing.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like the oceans and the atmosphere and all of that are changing pretty dramatically. I mean, it's been obvious to me in my travels and both doing marine science work and doing international science reporting is, I mean, climate change is happening, and if you go to the most vulnerable places, it's extremely obvious and human. You don't have to think about it theoretically. When I went down to Antarctica while researching Ocean's End in the late 90s, and already even then, you know, the U.S. research station down on the Antarctic Peninsula, Palmer Station, is located on an island with an enormous glacier behind it. This is sort of sheer wall you can hike up that goes up, you know, I don't know what it must be, like 1,000 feet, and it's 10,000 years old. Except that if you look at the photographs in the station from 15, 20 years ago, it ends, you know, right outside the outhouse, the back of the station. And now you go out there and there's an entire long field, you know, many football fields before you reach there, because it's scrolling back from the landscape every year faster and faster, even though it's 10,000 years old. You're seeing change at that rate. And indeed, all around the station, you know, the cold weather loving penguins that the station is there to study are all disappearing from their range because they can't survive. They can't nest properly. They don't have access to the sea ice that they've become used to. Things that, you know, creatures that have been there for thousands and thousands of years suddenly can't tolerate the new climate. Been up to Greenland, where people actually live, and similar things are starting to go on. I was up there just a few years ago, and all of the, you know, the Greenlanders, there are no roads in the country between any two cities because the glaciers and the landscape are too absolutely ridiculously hostile to do that or to keep plowed, and the population centers wouldn't justify the expense. So in winter, that's when you get around by sled dog and you travel around on the frozen sea ice because the terrain's inhospitable, but you got flat land to go to with the sled dogs. Except now the sea ice isn't forming, and people are all suddenly isolated all winter, which is normally their traveling season when you go out and see people, and they're starting to get rid of their sled dogs because it's been 8, 10 years since the sea ice was proper to use them. And they're all isolated and totally changing their lives. That's true throughout the whole northern stretch of Greenland. In the far south, they're starting to grow broccoli for the first time since Leif Erikson was there before the advent of the little ice age. I mean, things that haven't happened in a very long time suddenly are happening very, very quickly, including the crops that they can grow. And you not only see that, but you're starting to see, like you say, in the biochemistry, which really struck me. As the oceans warm up, you know, I like to scuba dive, seeing the effect that that's starting to have on coral reefs in terms of bleaching and such. And I remember being down in Grenada at a meeting and going diving with I was assigned a perfect stranger as a dive buddy, and we were talking about how the reefs had been declining compared to what we'd seen in areas that were more pristine, and I started mentioning this problem of ocean acidification, where because of all the extra carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, a lot of that, fortunately for us, on one level, is being absorbed by the oceans, but so much CO2 has been absorbed it's actually changing the pH value of the oceans, making them more towards the acid side of the spectrum than they used to be. And it turns out one of the effects of that is it makes harder for things that grow shells and calcium bodies around themselves, including corals, to grab those free calcium and calcinate minerals so they can do that. They become much less capable, and they become weaker and weaker. And I was mentioning this, and the guy got a strange look on his face, and it turned out, as he said, well, yes, you know, I was sealed 15 years ago in that biosphere 2. He was one of the biospherians, who was in Arizona, where they're going to seal themselves off into a self-contained environment. And it failed because all the breath from their CO2, they were starting to have CO2 poisoning, and they had to eventually let them out after, I can't remember, a year or something like that. But one of the clues, while the CO2 was building up, they had a whole tank that he was responsible for as the marine scientist guy with all these corals and stuff in it that was supposed to provide the oxygen for the system. One of the problems was as the CO2 levels went up, he started watching the corals start dissolving. So I got that question is, are we headed in towards a world where the corals start dissolving? And, what do these kind of changes that we, see out there anecdotally, what do they mean for the oceans?
Well, I think ocean acidification has been one of the things that the scientific community has really understood to be a bit of a wake-up call. I think, Colin, we know that in the last 150 years of industrialization, we've essentially doubled the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. We do that because we have a hydrocarbon and coal-based economy. We're burning the fossil fuels, which we need for energy and transport, and of course the products of that combustion end up in the atmosphere. CO2 has never been higher in the atmosphere today than compared to over 10 million years since it was as high as it is today. Yes. Wow. It has been through cycles, up and down, and those are natural cycles, long before man's influence. But nevertheless, it is now climbing and climbing very rapidly in comparison to certainly the last series of ice ages. If it wasn't for those phytoplankton that we were talking about earlier, the CO2 input into the ocean, the CO2 level in the atmosphere would have been maybe 2.5 times what it is. And so the oceans are actually, as you say, acting as a sponge. They're a sink. So they've been helping us as we have been using up the fossil fuel reserves. The problem is that we seem to be reaching a point where that absorption process is starting to slow down. And the question is, why is that happening, and what are the impacts likely to be? So just a little bit of geochemistry here, because CO2 absorption into water is kind of a strange process. Normally we think of things as dissolving in water. They dissolve more easily when the water is warmer. Actually, CO2 dissolves in water that's cooler more easily. So that means that the polar regions are where we get more of the CO2 going into the water first. Why does that matter? Well, the polar regions are also the regions, particularly in the North Atlantic areas, where we form the new water that circulates around the ocean. That's where water sinks at the beginning and then travels through a long conveyor belt through the world's oceans. So yes, it is stopping the atmosphere from getting too high in CO2, but at the other hand, it's now becoming quite pervasive through the oceans, starting in the areas where new ocean water is actually being
pumped around.
So it's being pumped around. Second thing is that as Colin said, the carbon dioxide is making the water more acid. Indeed, if you have a bottle of water and a little pH meter and just blow into it, you can actually make water acid just from the CO2 that you're exhaling. So the same thing is happening in the ocean. And right now it's dropped by about 0.1 of a pH unit. It is expected maybe by as early as 2150 to go to about half a pH unit. Doesn't sound too much, but a pH unit is what we call a logarithmic scale. So that's 1 unit is a power of 10 change. So these are 5-fold, 8-fold, 10-fold changes in the acidity of the ocean. Now, as Colin said, the corals are one type of organism that have these calcium carbonate, these chalk skeletons. But they're not the only things in the ocean. The very same microplankton that are doing the photosynthesis and helping to reduce the CO2 and put the oxygen back in the atmosphere, per chance, make their skeletons out of chalk. So these things that are helping us as part of the ecology of the planet are also the ones that are going to be susceptible to some of the change that is going on. So they're skeletons of chalk we're starting to recognize, starting to show the early signs of ocean acidification. And they are part of this primary biological engine that is keeping the system in balance. There are different types of this chalk. That starts getting a little complicated. There is calcite, and there's another mineral phase called aragonite. So even the types of chalk vary between the organisms and the way they might respond to acidity. And finally, we've talked about the plankton and we've talked about the corals, but there's also the shellfish, the bivalves and the mollusks, and lobster shells. So there are a lot of other organisms there using the types of calcium carbonate to form their skeletons and form their protective outer shells. And of course, they're living also in conditions that may be susceptible to acidification. So it's a complex interplay, and part of the challenge of science is trying to understand how complex interactions start to come about. And that has been one of the great challenges of applying theoretical science from the laboratory or doing field-based experiments to something that you can usefully use to predict. It's one thing me sitting here and saying, Colin, I can tell you exactly how the acidity of ocean is going to change. And you're going to say, yeah, but what do we do about it? How do we go about solving this? So I know you've got some thoughts on how this sort of ecology of the ocean might actually be predicted going forward into the future, may be useful for managing.
Yeah, I mean, I have no idea what we're going to do about the acidification problem. That seems like one that would keep one awake at night. But in terms of the ecosystem side of things, my impression in reporting on all these places and watching these changes in marine systems around the world is the bottom line seems to be that we need to, as a species, start understanding and tailoring our interactions with the oceans so that we concentrate on making sure that we're keeping the ecosystems healthy. Because, I mean, even just from crude self-interest, if we want the maximum number of, X fish or whatever resource we're looking at from the oceans, we want them to be humming along at the best possible optimal pace so that the share of what you can take without damaging them is as large as possible, right? But to do that, you have to start understanding how some of the parts work. And unfortunately, a lot of fisheries and a lot of ocean systems have been laid low enough that we actually really do need to sort of get a grasp on how they function, what parts are important to them. We can no longer sort of go and say, we're going to do some calculus of the population model of the cod in this box on the map and predict, according to the computer models, that you can take 18,000 tons of that, and then have a totally separate bunch of guys in another room looking at the capelin or the fish that the cod eat, and completely separate from that, and that other is saying, well, we have a surplus of these capelin. Let's let the Soviets come in and take all of it, because we're not using it, Well, the cod from the guys next door actually are. You're starving your cod next door. And this is exactly what happened in Newfoundland when one of the reasons the cod stocks got in trouble is the other branch of fisheries started having the Soviets come in with factory freezer trawlers and scoop up all these unused capelin that the cod were eating. Those kind of things, the interactions with habitat and where do these things live, and if you go along and damage this particular environment or fish them all while they're spawning, you can end up damaging the future of the resource. So yeah, I think that's what we need to do, is we need to understand the systems well enough so we can interact with them and get the most stuff we can from them without hurting them, because we'll need it, right? We're about to hit, we're a world of 3 billion when I was born not that long ago, and we're going to hit, we're what, 7 now, and we're going to hit 9 or 10 by 2050. We're going to need all this stuff. So the question and the problem is, how do we gather the information with these incredibly complicated systems to have any hope of doing that sort of thing? And I mean, how do we do it, say, in the Gulf of Maine, close to home?
Well, ideally, from a scientific point of view, we'd be wanting to make the measurements of the entire environment and all the organisms living there continuously, night and day, week after week, year after year, and building complex interactive models that would help us to predict that. And clearly, that would be a massive use of resources and a huge challenge to try and do that. But scientists are making progress at thinking about novel ways of collecting data, and to do that in a routine way that builds up a picture of the ecosystem and the environment in which the organisms that are living. A short plug for one of my colleagues at Bigelow, Barney Balch, who's had a paper just recently published about the Gulf of Maine, essentially 15 years of the work of himself and his team using ships of opportunities, the ferries that were crossing across to Nova Scotia, and more recently even using autonomous or robot underwater vehicle to collect data routinely going between Maine and Nova Scotia. Now, when you do that, every season, year after year, you start to get a sense of how at least the physics and the chemistry of the Gulf of Maine waters are changing.
Because you're getting a cross-section.
You're getting a cross-section.
Right.
You're kind of looking down in the water column a few hundred meters, and you're looking east to west as you travel across the Gulf. And, of course, you can bring in other information as well, such as how wet it's been, the rivers of Maine and the other rivers discharging into the Gulf. They've been undergoing change over this time period. And the ocean currents that have been traveling south from Nova Scotia, from further north of Labrador, they've also been changing. So when you start to collect information in this way, and the scientists call it time series, that's the name we give to it, but it gives us a perspective in the time domain as well as the spatial domain, which is where the old fisheries data used to be collected. And Barney and his group have actually seen that the Gulf has gone through some pretty dramatic changes, and particularly 5 to 6 years ago, the primary production, that is essentially the phytoplankton, the organisms we were talking about earlier, they've declined quite sharply. Now, the question, of course, is why has that happened? It's kind of like the reverse effect from the Black Sea one that you were talking about earlier. And they hypothesize that it is actually due to the wetter climate, that is more river discharge, and that fresher water in the Gulf of Maine is pushing the more salty but nutrient-rich water that was flowing south and not allowing it to come into the Gulf and replenish the nutrients for the phytoplankton stock. Of course, the issue is going to be, things need to eat that phytoplankton further on and to build up part of the food chain. And does this mean the productivity of the Gulf will decrease now in the next few years to come? And I think the challenge with science is that we're looking at little snapshots of time. It takes us a great deal of effort and energy to do that, and we can start to hypothesize about what the future will be. But I think historical records, and I know you've looked into this, they give us another sense of how things have changed. Maybe you would like to tell us a little bit about that.
Well, yeah, if you're taking snapshots in time now, one of my concerns, I guess one of the things that's happening in science is how do you know what's normal, or what should we consider to be normal and healthy? I mean, a lot of research is now this shifting baselines phenomenon where people don't live all that long, and so you start losing track of what used to be normal. You can go back into the 1840s and 1850s, and you get all these fishermen, hook and line fishermen, writing into the Fisheries Commission complaining that these early trawlers with steam-powered trawlers are completely destroying the ecosystem, and that there's now, all the fish are smaller and much scarcer than they used to be when they were kids. And you can keep reading similar letters all the way through the 19th century and into the 20th century when you kind of go back and wonder, what are those guys in the 1840s, what did they think was out there? Right. Well, we're starting to be able to actually find out, because you're probably familiar with the work done down at UNH with the historical mapping, basically sort of forensic fisheries ecology, where they're trying to recreate what did the fish stocks look like back before we really had proper records in the 19th century. And fortunately, some researchers were able to find in the Blue Hill Customs District 2 sets of data that let them accurately figure out how many fish were being caught and how big they were from the customs data. And this was customs data for the Blue Hill Customs District, which at the time was basically just that one peninsula between Castine and Brooklyn, just shy of Ellsworth and on the other side of the bay. Just that one peninsula. And all the fish that were being caught, they were being caught by guys in the, I think this was 1862, 1863, in open sailing vessels using hand lines, which they then had to pull up with a cod at the end of them. And when they ran the data, they had to run it several times because it was such a large figure that these guys, using this primitive technology within sight of land in this one district, were catching more cod than all of the fishermen in the entire Gulf of Maine with the trawlers and depth sounders and everything else and nets and all gear types put together are catching in a year now. I mean, one customs district. And as the scientist said, when you do the math then and you work back and think, what were they eating? What kind of fish stocks were available then? What does that mean for what the productivity of the system, what it would have looked like even then? And this, again, is at a time when a generation or two of fishermen had already been complaining that we've destroyed the fish stocks. What do you do with those kind of moving time signatures when you're studying science and detecting what's normal?
Yeah. So that introduces a huge challenge about our perspective of the baseline. What is normal, and more importantly, how are we going to manage forward going into the future? I think, as a scientist, I think there is a cause for optimism about the way that we are approaching this in a more holistic way. I use that word to introduce the concept of the hard science, the social sciences, the climatology, blending that together to better understanding of some of the changes that are going on. We also know that the oceans are more bountiful than just the fish stocks. There are other things that the oceans offer. Clearly, they offer beauty, they offer a refreshment of the soul, if you like, and people have sought the oceans for generations as a place in which to find the meanings of life. But they also offer new opportunities, in particular some of the microbial organisms, the new products from the sea. These might be biochemical products that may be used in human health care or animal nutrition. There are energy sources where we can actually use a better understanding of these microorganisms to properly generate the raw materials that could be a future energy source.
So you could grow algal fuels?
Well, essentially, I mean, when we're drilling an oil well, we're essentially taking the geologic product of algae that have decomposed over many millions of years to produce the hydrocarbon and the gas that we then use as an energy resource. What if we could shortcut that in a certain way, in a controlled fashion, use the waste nutrients that were going down the Danube into the Black Sea, could do that in a controlled fashion, find the right kind of algae that would be producing the lipids and the long chain compounds that then could be transformed into biofuels, and to do that in a recirculating energy neutral environment to create the raw materials for additional energy sources that we're going to need.
Aren't you doing that right at Bigelow, that kind of research?
Well, we're trying to. We're certainly trying to understand the molecular machinery in these algal cells that gives them a propensity for producing these kinds of chemical compounds and energy materials. And I should say that that's happening in other parts of the world as well. But I think that's how science works. We build on the work of others, and we try to do that in a responsible fashion. I think we also want to advocate for the health of the oceans going forward. If we can find ways to diagnose the state of an ocean before it's the crash of the fish stock, or before the pollution is clearly impacting on the human populations that are living along its coast, or before the ecosystem starts to degrade and collapse, wouldn't that be a powerful technique? And of course, the microbes, they're multiplying very fast. So essentially, we don't have to wait for whole generations of fish stocks. What if we can see this within the fast generation turnover of the microbes?
Faster than gerbils.
Faster than gerbils. Then we might have a way of helping to diagnose some of these problems that we've seen so far over the last few decades and not repeat them again. Sure. So I have a cause for some optimism about the value of science. It certainly is going to require a lot of diligence going forward, and it is somewhat distressing about the way in which science and politics and energy and food all intermingle together. But I think one of the opportunities to have discussions like this is to see where those interactions are and how they might play out in the future in a more meaningful way.